Picture this. You're standing in a candlelit room, thick with incense and decay. The floor is polished marble, but it's sticky in places. There are goblets on every surface, gold, ivory, glass, and one in particular glows strangely in the firelight. Silver, but not quite. Its surface almost moves. You lean closer and realize it isn't reflection. It's mercury, beaten and shaped into a chalice so carefully it almost seems alive. And beside it, a boy, no older than 12, royal, clearly. His robes are too heavy, his skin too pale, and his eyes already too old. He lifts the chalice with trembling fingers, guided not by curiosity, but by instruction. You watch as he tips it to his lips and drinks, not water, not wine, something colder, thicker, and invisible to the servants watching from the edges of the room. Something irreversible. The chalice was a gift. From a physician, from a philosopher, from a charlatan with a royal seal. Because the boy was born sick, and when princes are born sick, the world bends to try and fix them. Even if the cure is madness in disguise. He finishes the draught. The silver trickles down the corner of his mouth. No one stops him. Because this is a royal ritual. Because the chalice was made for him. And because sometimes the poison is more comforting than the truth. He had never drawn a full breath. From the moment he emerged from his mother's broken body, blue, silent, almost weightless, the whispers began, not of celebration, but of doubt. His fingers curled like claws, his skull was soft, sunken just slightly, and the midwives exchanged glances that would haunt the queen's dreams for years to come. This was not the heir they had prayed for, but he lived, and so the lie had to live with him. They named him strong things, names that meant victory, sun, glory. But he coughed blood in winter, shivered through silk in summer. His bones didn't grow right. His joints ached before he could walk, and there was always this smell, sweet, metallic. Some said it was the mercury, others said it came from inside him. The court did not pity him, it performed pity, painted it on in soft smiles and hollow gestures. But everyone knew a sick heir meant instability. Power-hungry uncles suddenly stayed longer at court. Ambassadors asked veiled questions about succession. Mothers from rival houses began sending portraits of their sons. And behind the heavy velvet curtains, the prince wasted. He read constantly, they said, obsessed over alchemy, spoke too softly, too slowly, and always looked just past whoever was speaking to him. His hands were always cold, his skin thin enough to see the blue of his veins. He was curious, distant, frightening in his stillness. He was not expected to live past 13, but he did, and in doing so, he became dangerous. Not to others, yet, but to himself, because the more the world denied his strength, the more desperately he sought to manufacture it, and every morning the chalice waited. It began as a tincture, a few drops under the tongue, laced with something metallic and bitter. The court physicians called it a tonic of the ancients, a gift from Paracelsus himself, alchemy in liquid form. They said it would warm his blood, strengthen his lungs, and purify the humours that plagued his pale, trembling body. But it was mercury, distilled quicksilver, suspended in vinegar and herbs to mask its sting. And because the prince was desperate to live, truly live, not merely exist like a shadow trailing behind the throne, he drank it without question. At first it worked, or so they thought. His cheeks grew flushed, his energy surged. He walked longer distances, spoke with a newfound clarity. Ministers whispered that a miracle had occurred, that the boy, long marked for the grave, had cheated fate. But Mercury does not cure, it deceives. Inside his body, it slipped through membranes, crossed into his brain, poisoned his liver. His hands shook again, slightly at first, then with increasing violence. His pupils dilated, his mouth filled with ulcers. The same ministers who once praised his recovery now averted their eyes when he entered a room, because the flush in his cheeks had turned to a permanent, fevered red. His breath grew hot, his hair brittle, and still he drank. The doctors called it calomel now, or red salt of mercury, names to soften the horror. They mixed it with gold leaf and powdered pearl, telling him it was royalty reborn in a cup. But no matter how elegant the vessel, poison remains poison. Soon his skin began to thin, then split. At first it flaked, tiny scales of flesh peeling from his arms and neck. Then came the fissures, cracks that opened along his spine and ribs, leaking blood and clear fluid onto the silken pillows embroidered with his name. He wept quietly when it hurt too much to move, but he never asked them to stop, because stopping meant surrendering to the weakness, and weakness had become his greatest fear. His body was breaking, and he knew it. But in the corridors of power, it was better to be a madman on fire than a corpse in cold repose, better to burn than rot. So he lifted the chalice again, hands trembling, and drank the thing that was killing him, because if he was to die, he would die by his own design, not theirs. They called it transmutation, the sacred promise that base things, lead, illness, sorrow, could be turned into gold. It was a dream older than the crown he wore and the language he spoke, and in the cold stone laboratories beneath the palace, cloaked in fumes and desperation, that dream was carved into reality. Or so they believed. By now the prince's body was no longer entirely his own. His skin peeled like bark from a dying tree. The elegant curve of his spine had bowed beneath fever. He slept on linen soaked in vinegar, while servants dabbed at his open sores with tinctures they didn't understand. He still drank the mercury, though it no longer resembled medicine. It was thicker now, congealed with ash and honey, administered with reverence by trembling hands. Because the physicians no longer treated him, they worshipped him. He was their experiment made flesh, their living crucible. In secret, the court alchemist kept journals filled with drawings, bone-thin silhouettes, swollen organs, notations in Latin and Greek. He believed the prince was proof of a cosmic boundary being crossed, that beneath all the horror, some divine truth was taking shape in the suffering. The philosopher's patient, he wrote, as if pain were holy and rot could be beautiful, if only one understood its purpose. The prince heard none of this, or rather, he no longer listened. Sound had become distorted, as though echoing from underwater. Faces blurred. His mother's voice, once the only sound that soothed him, now grated like stone against iron. The one thing that remained vivid was light, blinding light. From the fire that burned night and day in the alchemical furnaces, the heat that warped mirrors and seared skin. They told him it was the light of rebirth, but he smelled death in it. In the corridors outside his room, the servants whispered of ghosts, of the way his reflection sometimes lingered a moment too long in polished brass, of the way his shadow moved even when he didn't. Some said he had already died, and the thing in his bed was simply residue, ashes formed into a crown-wearing shape, breathing only by habit. And yet they kept feeding him the elixirs, the gold dust, the quicksilver, the wine laced with arsenic and rosewater, anything to keep the great experiment alive one day longer. He was no longer a prince, he was a kiln, and they would stoke him with fire until he cracked completely. Because what they pursued wasn't healing, It was revelation. Not a cure for the boy, but proof that nature could be defied, that death could be danced with, that something precious might be coaxed from the wreckage of a royal body, if only they burned him down to the bone. And the prince, too tired to refuse, let them try. It began at the edges, first the fingertips. A quiet shedding, skin that came off like parchment soaked in wine, curling at the corners, revealing a raw, wet pinkness beneath. The physician said it was the mercury drawing out the bad humours, that this peeling was not a symptom, but a sign, that the body, in its infinite wisdom, was discarding what no longer served. But it did not stop. Next came the lips, splitting when he spoke, flaking when he smiled. His mouth tasted like iron, and when he drank from the silver chalice, they still offered him each dawn. Flecks of his own skin floated back in the mirrored surface. Still he drank because that was what they told him to do, because to stop was to surrender. And princes did not surrender, even when their own flesh betrayed them. The courtiers no longer looked him in the eye. They bowed deeper than before, voices thick with sympathy they did not feel. But behind closed doors their tongues wagged. They called him the Molting One, said his illness was divine punishment, or a curse from the stars, or worse, the result of unclean blood. Whispers of illegitimacy surfaced, ancient rumors resurrected by opportunists eager to rewrite the line of succession, while the boy who held it slowly disintegrated behind silk-draped walls. His nurses changed the bedsheets thrice daily. No matter how soft the linen, it stuck to his back, tore from his thighs. The skin sloughed off in patches now, large obscene pieces, like bark from a wounded tree. The pain was constant, a low hum beneath every breath. He no longer cried out. There was no point. The mirror had been removed. He hadn't asked. He simply noticed one morning that it was gone, as if someone else had realized what he dared not say aloud, that to see himself was to acknowledge the horror of what he had become. Once, briefly, he had glimpsed his reflection in a polished bowl of water. The face looking back was not his own. It was blistered and slack, the eyes sunken into deep violet hollows. The hair, once thick and perfumed, hung in clumps like wet straw. He looked like something that had been burned. And still they insisted he was healing. Still they praised his fortitude, celebrated each morning he awoke as a victory for science, for progress, for the future of medicine. Behind every careful bandage, every cooling poultice, there was a thirst, for fame, for legacy, for the answer to the question, what happens if we push just a little further? At night, when the chambers fell quiet and the torches burned low, he would run his hands over what was left of his face. The skin there felt foreign, tight in some places, spongy in others, like it belonged to someone else. And maybe it did. Maybe in some deeper sense, he had already left the body that betrayed him. Maybe the real prince was somewhere else now, watching the slow unpeeling from the rafters, or the cracks in the stone, or the smoke that curled from the endless fire in the alchemist's furnace. There were nights he dreamed he had no skin at all, that he was made only of light and veins and smoke, walking barefoot through the dark corridors of the palace while no one dared look at him, that the throne, gleaming in the moonlight, waited patiently at the end of the hall, not for a king, but for something worse, something sacred and ruined, something no longer fully human. He always woke just before he sat down. They brought him a mirror one morning, not by accident, not as part of some routine, but with intention. Carried by two silent attendants who refused to meet his gaze, setting it down as if offering a relic to a shrine. It was framed in gilded brass, polished until it gleamed like a sunbeam to a caught in glass. For weeks he had not seen his reflection, not truly. Not since his skin had started coming off in sheets, not since the patches turned purple, then black, then simply vanished. He didn't ask for it, but they wanted him to look, to see what remained, or perhaps what hadn't survived. The mirror waited, still, cold, patient, and for a long moment he did nothing. But curiosity, that final sin, always survived the collapse of kingdoms. He stood, bones creaking like rotted wood, and stepped forward barefoot across the flagstones. The chill bit into his ankles, the mercury burned low in his stomach, and the mirror refused him. At first it showed nothing, no flicker of shape, no outline of a body, just the trembling room behind him, velvet curtains, half-wilted lilies, a bowl of blackened fruit. But not the prince, not the patient, not the boy who'd once smiled too wide, who'd been told he was chosen. He blinked, still nothing. He reached out and touched the glass. It was warm, too warm, like someone had been standing behind it moments ago. But even as his fingers pressed against the surface, even as the breath in his throat trembled against the air, there was no hand to meet him, no face to mimic his sorrow. He had vanished, or the mirror had rejected him. Either way, something sacred had been severed. A gasp escaped from the maid behind him, small and sharp like a broken key. She crossed herself, whispered a prayer, fled the room before he could turn. He remained there, one palm flat on the surface, the other clenched by his side. And he did not move for hours, because if the mirror could not see him, was he still real? He had become something not merely sick, but unspeakable, unreflected, a wound without a body, a prince with no shape the world could hold. It was not death that frightened him, but this, that the very laws of nature, the quiet grammar of cause and consequence, of flesh and soul, no longer obeyed him. Later, when the physicians returned, they found the mirror cracked. Not shattered, but veined like frost, as if something inside it had tried to escape. No one spoke of it. The mirror was removed, the room was repainted. But the silence that followed was louder than any scream, because they all understood what it meant. The prince had slipped the last tether that bound him to the world. He could still speak, still breathe, still stagger down the halls in his gold-trimmed robes. But something fundamental had been lost. He no longer cast a reflection, and soon he would cast no shadow either. There had always been whispers in the marble halls, whispers behind gloved hands, beneath veils, behind curtains, drawn tight against the wind. They whispered about her, about the girl with the sweet perfume and the soft voice, who lingered by the prince's door longer than custom allowed. They whispered about the way she touched his sleeve when she thought no one saw, about the notes exchanged, about the candlelight in the West Tower after curfew. They said it wasn't love, that it was strategy, that a girl of her station with a sickly prince and a father who owed gambling debts to the crown knew exactly what she was doing. But even lies must taste sweet before they poison, and he believed her. In a world where even his own body betrayed him, her voice had seemed like truth when his gums bled, when his bones cracked beneath their own weight, when the smell of mercury made him retch in the middle of the night. She was the one who stayed. She touched the skin others flinched from, kissed the mouth no one dared look at, told him stories of a life beyond duty, promised him spring. She promised he would be remembered for more than his sickness, that they would escape this world of tinctures and bleeding bowls, that he would rule, and she would reign, not just beside him, but behind him, guiding, protecting, whispering in his ear. It was the lie he needed most, that he was not cursed but chosen, that the love she offered was more than pity, more than performance, but love, like medicine, can become toxic when taken too often. And the court watched. They always did. Love made a man vulnerable, made him disobedient, made him dangerous in the wrong hands, so the court made a spectacle of her betrayal. It began with a servant's confession, bribed, broken, or both. Then came the letter, the one she swore she never wrote, in which his secrets had been catalogued and mocked, his sores described in cruel poetry, his madness laughed at in ink. They said she never loved him, that she'd been promised to a nobleman in the north all along, that her visits had been reports, not affection, that her perfume had been laced with calming herbs, not for comfort, but for control. He didn't believe it, couldn't. Not even when they paraded her in chains before him, not even when she wept in silence while the Chancellor read her sentence. He searched her eyes, desperate to find the woman he remembered, the touch that steadied him, the voice that soothed. But she did not speak. She looked down, and with that silence, the truth, whatever it was, shattered. They dragged her from the palace. He tried to follow, stumbling barefoot through the snow, screaming that she had loved him, that they were liars, that he was king, that he was loved, but the gates closed, and something inside him never opened again. From that day on, he refused to be touched, refused to eat from plates he hadn't prepared himself, refused the company of women or men, of advisers or priests. The only companion he permitted was a thin, twisted sheet of parchment on which he wrote the same line every day. She believed me. Whether it was truth or madness, no one could say. But it was all he had left. The smell of rot had grown stronger, not just from the prince's body, but in the corridors, in the velvet drapes, in the folds of silk that once touched royal skin. A sickness clung to the palace now, invisible but live, and the ones who had claimed to cure it began to tremble. The doctors came in pairs now, never alone. They no longer spoke in confident Latin, but in panicked murmurs, palms sweating beneath their gloves. The rituals they had once performed with pride, bleeding, leeching, mercury tinctures, brewed in golden bowls, had turned into acts of fear. They had not cured the prince. They had hollowed him out. He no longer spoke to them. He didn't even look. But he knew they were there by the sound of their boots, shuffling, hesitant, echoing with guilt. Sometimes he laughed when they entered, a sharp, wet sound that made the younger ones flinch. It was not joy. It was knowledge. They had promised him purity and given him poison. They had written treatises in his name, sent letters to universities declaring that their method was divine, that the stars had aligned to bless their medicine. And when his hair began to fall out, when his teeth turned black, when his veins seemed to shimmer with the silver of their alchemy, they said it meant he was becoming transcendent. But now they whispered another word: decay. One by one they came to him, fell to their knees before the cracked tiles of his chamber floor. Their faces were pale, their hands ink-stained from records they had begun to burn. They begged forgiveness, not for their ignorance, but for their ambition, for seeing in him not a boy, not a patient, not even a prince, but a vessel, a chance to prove themselves to the world. He watched them grovel, his breath rattling like paper in his throat. He did not forgive them. He only asked for more mercury. It was not a plea, it was a sentence, and they obeyed, because they were too afraid not to, because the weight of their lies was heavier than the crown, because deep down they knew. He would die with their names on his tongue, and they would live with his ghost on their backs. They stopped touching him, not out of fear, but reverence, as though the absence of skin made him sacred, as though the rawness of his body revealed something divine. In the final months, the court no longer looked away. They looked through. Their prince, where once swaddled in ermine and gold thread, now lay swaddled in gauze, soaked red, stitched with the silence of those who had nothing left to say. His body, a map of what power does when no one dares to say no. The courtiers wore gloves now, not for warmth, but to pretend the stench didn't cling. They bowed deeper than before, eyes lowered, lips quivering with borrowed prayers. And still the ceremonies continued. Still he was carried to the chapel in a velvet-lined chair. Still the choir sang, while blood dripped down the seams of his robes. They called him radiant. They called him luminous. They said the prince was shedding the sins of his ancestors through flesh, that the angels would greet him, not as a man, but as a spirit who had passed through fire. But it wasn't holiness, it was rot. And yet, no one stopped it, because by now everyone was complicit. The skinless prince had become their mirror, a symbol of a kingdom too proud to admit it was dying from the inside out. And so they sat, powdered and perfumed, beneath frescoes of saints and martyrs, watching a boy melt before their eyes, and whispering that it must be the will of heaven. The vial trembled in his hand, not from weakness, though he had plenty of that, but from recognition, the way a drowning man knows the final wave. The mercury glinted in the candlelight, thick and silver, like melted mirrors. He didn't even grimace anymore. The taste was familiar now, like rust on the tongue, like inevitability. There were no doctors left in the room, just the old nurse who had been with him since he was swaddled in lace, now too afraid to speak. She had seen bones pierce through flesh like white roots through soil. She had seen the blood run clear, and still she did not stop him. He drank slowly, not because he savored it, but because he wanted to feel it. Because this was the one thing he could still choose, and when it was done, he closed his eyes and waited, for the pulse to stagger, for the breath to catch, for the darkness to open its arms. But the moment lingered longer than it should have, and for a flicker he almost laughed, almost. His last breath wasn't a cry or a gasp, it was a whisper, not of regret, but of relief, because the alchemy was finished. The prince, who drank poison to heal, had finally left a body that could no longer hold him, and the silence that followed was not grief, it was mercy. They buried what remained of him in silk and silver, not because there was anything left to honor, but because myths do not rot the way flesh does. The court physicians issued statements, of course, a sudden decline, a tragic relapse, nothing that implicated their own tinctures, their own trembling hands. The alchemists vanished into smoke, their scrolls quietly burned in the dead of night, and those who had loved him, or claimed to, found new names to whisper, new airs to flatter. But the people remembered, not the boy himself, not really, but the legend that began to calcify around his bones, that he had been too pure for this world, that his suffering had been holy, that the prince had willingly consumed silver to cleanse his blood, to absorb sin to save a kingdom. He became a relic, a warning, a saint of poison and mirrors, and though his name would fade from ledgers and lineages, the image remained, a pale boy with skin like parchment, lifting a silver chalice to trembling lips, choosing his own undoing in a world that could offer no cure. Some said his soul turned to quicksilver, that he still dripped through palace walls when the moon was full, listening, waiting, and watching those who made monsters and called it medicine, The throne he was born to no longer existed, not truly. By the time his brittle lungs gave out, the palace had changed hands, the court had shed its colours like a snake in molt, and new names echoed through the same stone halls where he had once coughed up blood onto silk pillows. His siblings, if they lived, had been scattered like coins thrown into a well, each lost to exile, madness, or obscurity. His portrait, once draped in embroidered banners, was quietly removed, the canvas left to dry crack in a forgotten gallery. No heir, no monument, no lineage, only a memory that made courtiers flinch, that made doctors grow quiet when asked about the past. The alchemical prince, once believed to be salvation, was now a spectre no one wanted to speak of, his titles dissolved, his claim erased, his future buried beside him. He was heir to nothing, not even his own story.